Hello. First off, I'm going to put a link in the description to a sketch by a comedy duo called Mitchell and Webb, just because I think it's hideously appropriate to current circumstances and I thought you'd enjoy it. It's set in what looks to be a nuclear post-apocalyptic world, but it would work just as well for a post-plague world. So, a post-plague world if we don't get the thing under reasonable control. It seemed quite funny when it was made. I suppose it must have been about 10 years ago. Doesn't seem quite so hilarious now, I have to warn you. But it does posit the almost complete destruction of society, and although we at this time will probably get away with it without complete destruction, there's absolutely no doubt that it will involve very serious disruption, with several things about our society being irreversibly changed. Work patterns, for instance, even transport patterns. Yeah, I don't think things are going to go back the way they were, as if this never happened. One of the major casualties, though, of this outbreak will be the EU. It's just going to fall apart. It might not happen all at once, but it will happen. Which is a bit of a joke, because if we here in the UK had waited just another few months, we could have simply slipped out of the EU without anyone noticing, like the only sober guest at a drunken party that got a bit excessive and just sort of sidled out the back door. But anyway, we didn't. And there you are. Instead, we went through 3 years of uncertainty, 2 years of being openly lied to by politicians who said they were taking us out when they were plainly doing no such thing. Yes, I'm talking to you, Mrs. May. And then the whole thing culminating in what amounted to complete anarchy in the Houses of Parliament, with also what amounted to a schoolboy riot, the likes of which both houses haven't seen since the 18th century. But it's over now. And now it's the turn of the other countries, who are currently, if you notice, not turning to the EU for help, despite the jingoistic speeches by the EU commissioners. No, these countries are taking the law into their own hands, and they're closing their own borders and throwing out their own invaders, or at least repelling them, and they are using their own laws to control the spread of the disease by controlling the freedom of movement of their citizens in their own generally historical ways, because the EU isn't up to it. It lacks the flexibility and the speed of procedure to get the laws into place. It even lacks the local knowledge to deal with the differences in various situations. I heard a radio interview conducted by a talk show host called Nick Ferrari, in which he asked the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock MP, why fewer Germans died of the virus than Brits. And the answer was simply this: the first wave of German victims of the disease were people who'd returned from skiing holidays in Italy. They were strong, fit people. The people in Britain who died were a completely different demographic. And that's where the EU would fail, because the sort of system it has couldn't account for something like that, which is sort of obvious when you talk about it, but it's not obvious when you're making laws. Now, I'm going to skid sideways for a couple of minutes, but don't worry, I am going somewhere with this. Let's just take a break to consider ancient Greece and classical Greek plays. They weren't all marvellous, you know, however much we idealise them. And one of the least marvellous ideas they had to finish up a play was the twist known as apo mechanes theos, or in Latin, Deus ex Machina, or in English, God out of the machine. A machine in ancient Greece was any sort of a contraption like a wooden crane on wheels. Nothing very complicated, and it was used like this. If a god turns up in a play, that god never just walks onto the stage, obviously. It's a god, so he or she might appear through a trapdoor in the stage floor, or might descend sitting on a swing hung from a crane, the crane being known as a machine. And the function of the god in many of these cases would be to sort out an intractable problem that the writer had got himself into. So you call in a god to simply magic everything better. And in this case, the coronavirus is going to fulfill just that purpose for a lot of governments who have felt that they were trapped in the EU and had no way of extricating themselves with any sort of dignity. Well, a lot of people are going to die from this disease. And I'm not saying that with any relish at all. I'm not being flip about it at all either, because with my history of asthma, I'm probably a prime candidate for adding to the statistics. But even more than the psychological shock of a lot of deaths all at once, which will reverberate through hitherto comfortable and smugly satisfied Western societies, there will be the even more shocking problem of mass loss of jobs and business failures, and that takes a long time to recover from. I'm not talking about hot dog salesmen either, for instance. Airlines are going to fail. And that's because people aren't going to be travelling for months. And this will have a knock-on effect for all sorts of communications, including import and export. As a matter of fact, it might even give a popular boost to the disastrously unpopular high-speed rail system, which is now being built at great expense in England. But yeah, that's another matter. Society is going to be very deeply changed and very badly disrupted in all sorts of ways, and the EU just isn't up to either the speed of events or to managing this sort of crisis. Furthermore, countries are going to have to do some serious budgeting to deal with these long-term repercussions, and one of the first things they're going to be thinking of while they're busy looking for coins down the back of the sofa is that one expense they can do without is the rent they're paying to the EU to keep those expensive buildings in the EU head offices well supplied with smoked salmon and asparagus. Now, the EU is already under financial stress. When the United Kingdom leaves at the end of December of this year, that's a £20 billion cash cow just ambling out of the EU milking parlour, and they'll have to find the cash from somewhere else. They've already been holding meetings with other EU countries, telling them they'll have to up their contributions, and as I understand it, they have met with some resistance. And even worse, they've been talking about starting up an army. Armies are expensive. I can't see that going down too well with the rest of the EU, such as it is. Now, many of the people in these EU countries have known for a while that all was not well in the Schengen zone, and their political classes were hearing the rumblings of discontent, no doubt, but they just lacked the excuse to act. Now, as they pull up the drawbridges, they have the perfect excuse, and many of them are going to take full advantage of it. So, well, I'm not a prophet or anything like that, but I don't think it takes much supernatural powers of foresight to see that the EU is going to have a lot of trouble surviving this tsunami. And I'm just sitting here hoping I'll be around to have a little dance on its grave from the top. If you want to donate or contact, the information will be rolling over the Graniopteryx as I speak. Please like, subscribe and share because it does help with the algorithm. If you visit my channel on YouTube and one day discover that I've disappeared without warning, you'll still find me on BitChute or Minds. Just go to either of those platforms and do a search for Graniopteryx. If you're already watching this on BitChute or Minds, good for you. Meanwhile, if you're watching this on YouTube, remember that you must keep checking the subscribe and bell icons because occasionally they reset. Till next time.